I never meant to stay that late. The sun had already dropped behind the ridge, bleeding its last light across the paddocks like a wound that refused to close. The air was heavy with the smell of hay and wet earth. You could almost taste the metal in it, that faint electric edge that comes just before night finishes swallowing everything. I remember thinking the world felt suspended, neither day nor night, just breath held somewhere between. That's when I saw him again. The horse. He stood alone near the far fence, his coat darkened by sweat and shadow until he seemed carved from the same dusk that wrapped the fields. His name was Atlas, though I never called him that at first. Names felt too human, too small for something that large, that silently alive. When he turned his head toward me, the last glimmer of sunset caught his eyes. Amber, startled, impossibly knowing. And something inside me cracked open in recognition. Not of him, not yet, but of the ache that had been living behind my ribs for years. I'd been coming to the stables every evening since the accident. I told people it was therapy, but really it was survival. I needed the rhythm of hooves on dirt, the smell of hay, the routine of brushing and feeding and cleaning stalls. Anything to quiet the noise in my head. Anything that asked nothing of me except to keep showing up. The horses didn't ask questions. They didn't try to fix me. They just existed beside me, massive and breathing and steady, especially him. Atlas had been difficult since the day they brought him in. They said he'd belonged to a rancher who worked him too hard, then left him half-starved when money ran out. When he arrived, he kicked the stalls, bit at anyone who came near. A broken creature, they said, dangerous. But when I looked at him that first day, trembling in the far corner of his stall, eyes wide with mistrust, I thought, we're the same kind of broken. The trainers avoided him mostly, keeping their distance behind polite warnings, but I couldn't. Every evening after my shifts at the diner, I'd drive down the dirt road to the stables, headlights sweeping across the fences. Radio turned off so I could listen to the sound of tires on gravel, proof that I was still moving forward. I'd stop by his stall, lean against the wooden gate, and just talk. Not the kind of talking that expects answers, more like confession. The kind that spills out because silence is too heavy to hold. He never came close those first weeks. Sometimes he'd flick an ear or stamp his foot, restless, wary, but he listened. I could feel it. The way his breathing slowed when I spoke, the slight tilt of his head like he was catching meaning in the air between us. That was enough to keep me coming back. That evening, when the sky bruised itself into twilight, I stepped through the gate with the brush in my hand. My heartbeat was a sound I could feel in my throat. I moved slow, my boots sinking into the damp straw. He didn't move away this time. His head lifted, muscles rippling along his flank, then stilled. I reached out, palm open, letting him decide. When his muzzle touched my skin, warm and trembling, it felt like the first real touch I'd had in months. Something inside me steadied. The nights grew longer after that. I stopped noticing the time, stopped caring if my phone filled with unread messages. My mother's voice on voicemail sounded like someone else's concern. The world beyond the fences blurred until all that remained was the dim light of the barn and the steady rhythm of breath between me and him. I'd talk about my father, about the way he left before I was old enough to remember his reasons, about the accident on the highway that stole my brother and left the house full of echoes. I told Atlas things I'd never told another living soul, words that felt too fragile to survive outside the low hum of the barn's quiet. He'd listen, always. His stillness wasn't empty. It was attention made flesh, and sometimes when I fell silent, he'd shift closer, pressing the length of his body against the rail as if to remind me he was real, that something solid still existed in this dissolving world. One night, a storm rolled in without warning. The air split open with thunder, and the horses screamed, a high, wild sound that shook the rafters. I ran down the aisle, rain pounding the tin roof, heart slamming. Atlas was thrashing, eyes rolling white in the dim light. The storm had crawled inside him. I remember shouting his name, the word torn out of me like a promise. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat he looked like a mythic thing, muscles carved in light and fear. I climbed the gate and dropped into the stall before I could think. He could have crushed me, but I reached for him anyway, hands trembling, voice low. I don't remember what I said, just that I kept talking. a stream of words meant to build a bridge back to calm. Slowly, impossibly, his body softened. He pressed his forehead against my shoulder and stood there, shaking. The thunder broke again, but this time he didn't flinch. We stayed like that until the storm moved on. After that night, something changed. He started waiting for me at the gate, pacing until I arrived. When I walked into the barn, his ears would flick forward before any other sound reached him. It felt dangerous, the way he began to read me, the way I began to need it. There was a mirror between us, invisible but absolute. Every tremor of fear, every unspoken thought seemed to echo from one to the other. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling for no reason. Sometimes I'd cry while brushing his mane, the tears mixing with dust until I couldn't tell what was grief and what was release. It wasn't love, not the way people mean it when they talk about each other. It was something older, quieter, a recognition. Days turned to weeks, and soon the whole ranch knew about us. They joked that I'd finally tamed the wild one. I let them think that, but inside I knew the truth. He'd tamed the parts of me that didn't believe in staying. I started riding him after sunset, when the air cooled and the world turned silver under the moon. At first he was restless, uncertain beneath the saddle, but the rhythm came quick, like we were remembering something we'd both forgotten. The night wind tasted of salt and soil, and when we galloped, it felt like flight stripped of wings. Sometimes I'd whisper to him that we were running away from the past. Other nights I'd tell him we were chasing it down. He seemed to understand both. The other riders kept their distance. They said the bond was strange, intense. Maybe they were right, but I didn't care. Out there in the dark fields, with only the stars for witnesses, I felt more human than I ever did among people. The quiet between each hoofbeat was a kind of prayer. Then came the night everything changed. It started like any other. I had closed up the diner late, hands still smelling faintly of coffee and bleach. The moon was high and thin, a coin balanced on the edge of the sky. I remember the hum of the highway fading behind me, the tires cutting through fog. When I reached the barn, the lights were out. Only the low buzz of insects and the soft rustle of straw greeted me. Atlas was waiting, but something in his stance was off. He stood still, neck arched, ears forward, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I stepped closer, whispering his name, but he didn't move. The air felt wrong, charged, too quiet. That's when I saw it. The broken latch on his stall, the faint smear of blood along the wood. Atlas, I breathed, my voice barely sound. I reached for him, but before my fingers touched his mane, he bolted. The door burst open, splinters flying, and he was gone. Dark muscle and panic swallowed by the night. I didn't think. I ran. The field lights were off, the night thick as smoke, but I could still hear him. The pounding of hooves like a storm breaking loose inside the earth. My boots tore through wet grass, heart hammering against my ribs. Every breath felt like glass. The fog had rolled in from the river, swallowing the fences, the trees, the world. Atlas, I screamed, but the sound dissolved into the dark. Somewhere ahead, something crashed. A wooden gate splintering. And then silence. The kind that swallows everything. I stopped, bent over, trying to listen through the roar in my ears. Nothing. Just the drip of rain from the eaves and the far, distant hum of a highway that never cared who lived or died beside it. I grabbed the flashlight from the barn wall and stumbled into the pasture. The beam wavered over the ground. Torn grass, muddy prints, fragments of wood like bones scattered through the field. He'd gone through the north gate, toward the ridge. The steep one. My stomach turned cold. When I reached the slope, the mud gave way beneath me, and I slid, catching myself on a rock slick with moss. My hands stung. The flashlight beam cut through the fog like a blade, catching glimpses of movement. Maybe him, maybe nothing. Atlas. My voice cracked this time, breaking on the name like a wave. Then, from somewhere below, a sound. Not loud, not the thunder of hooves, just a low, shuddering breath. I followed it down. He was there, halfway in the clearing, sides heaving, one leg tangled in a fallen branch. Steam rose from his body in the cold air, his coat shining with sweat. His head jerked up when he saw the light, eyes wild with confusion and fear. I dropped to my knees beside him. "Hey," I whispered, even though my chest was still burning from the run. "It's me." "I'm here." He struggled again, the branch creaking beneath him. I reached out, slowly, palm open the way I always did, the way he knew. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, misting the air between us. I could see the whites of his eyes, the tremor in his muscles. One wrong move and he'd hurt himself worse. "Easy," I said. "We're okay. We're okay, Atlas." It took time, slow words, slower breaths. I slid my hands under the branch, feeling the coarse bark bite into my palms. With a grunt, I heaved it aside. He staggered to his feet, trembling. Mud splattered up to his knees. When he leaned against me, it wasn't from weight. It was trust. The flashlight lay face up in the mud, beam cutting across the fog like a stage light. In that ghostly glow, I could see his chest rising and falling, his head bent low beside mine. The world felt smaller than it ever had. Just two creatures breathing the same air, alive by accident, connected by something neither of us understood. For a long time, we stayed there. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Of breath. Of heartbeat. Of something unspoken that hummed through the air like electricity after lightning has passed. When I finally led him back toward the barn, the sky had started to pale. The horizon cracked open with the faintest hint of blue. The storm had moved east, leaving behind a smell like iron and new beginnings. Inside the stall, I cleaned the mud from his legs, checked the scrape where the branch had caught him. It wasn't deep, just enough to sting. He watched me with that same steady stillness, his eyes following every movement. When I brushed the last of the dirt away, he leaned his head against my shoulder and stayed there. I didn't cry until later. That morning, I sat outside the barn, knees pulled up to my chest, watching the light spill over the pastures. My clothes were soaked, my hands raw, but I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness that didn't hurt. When I closed my eyes, I could still feel the weight of his head, the heat of his breath. I thought of the night he arrived, wild and trembling, and how I'd looked at him and seen my own reflection. Maybe what we're drawn to in others isn't beauty or kindness, but the familiar shape of our own brokenness. People came later, the ranch manager, the stable hands, their voices full of shock and questions. I answered as best I could, words falling out in fragments. They praised me for calming him, for finding him before he got to the road. But their words sounded far away. I wasn't proud. I wasn't brave. I was just awake again. That night, when everyone left, I returned to the barn. The air was heavy with the smell of hay and dusk. He stood in the stall, quiet, eyes half closed. When I stepped in, he shifted his weight, just enough to acknowledge me. "I thought I lost you," I said softly. He exhaled through his nose, a low, warm sound that seemed to answer back. I reached up and brushed a strand of mane from his face. Maybe that's what I've been doing all this time. Losing everything, waiting for something to stay. He blinked, slow and deliberate, and for a moment it felt like understanding. Days bled into one another. The world outside the ranch kept turning. People moving, laughing, scrolling through lives that no longer felt like mine. I didn't need any of it. My life had narrowed down to the essentials. The sound of hooves in the dirt, the scrape of a brush on his coat, the rhythm of his breath matching mine. It should have scared me, the way my world had shrunk. But it didn't. It felt pure. It felt honest. There was something in his silence that made me want to be better. To speak only what mattered, to move only when necessary, to feel without apology. And yet, there was a shadow that followed us. Something fragile about the peace we'd built. Maybe I knew even then that nothing this real can stay untouched for long. One evening, the ranch owner pulled me aside. "You've done good work with him," she said. "The clients are impressed. There's talk of selling him to a competition rider." My stomach turned cold. "He's not ready," I said. She smiled, polite, unmoved. "He's healed. That's what matters, but that wasn't it." Not to me. Healing isn't something you finish. It's something you live inside of. I nodded, because what else could I do? But that night, when I stood beside his stall, I felt something inside me unravel again. He lifted his head when I entered, ears flicking forward. I pressed my forehead to his and whispered, "They want to take you away." His breath shivered through me. "I don't know what to do," I said. "I can't stop them, but I can promise this. I'll be here every night until you go." The words broke something in me. I stayed longer than usual, tracing circles into the dust with my boot, listening to the low creak of the rafters. Outside, the moon was full, pouring its silver light through the gaps in the barn walls. He shifted closer, brushing his muzzle against my arm. I closed my eyes and let the world disappear again, the same way it had that first night, when everything was darkness except for the sound of his breathing. That night lasted forever. When dawn came, I didn't move. The light crawled across the floorboards, soft and slow, finding the edges of everything it touched. I felt it on my face and opened my eyes. Atlas was still beside me, standing as if he'd been guarding me through the hours I'd slept without meaning to. I rose, brushing the straw from my clothes. "We couldn't stop doing it," I murmured. "The ritual, the coming back, the talking, the being near. And maybe we shouldn't." His ears flicked, catching the sound of my voice. I smiled. Outside, the morning was new again. Dew sparkled on the fence lines. Somewhere far off, another horse called, but the sound didn't reach us fully. It felt like a world away. I knew what was coming. The sale, the separation, the undoing of everything we'd built. But for that moment, just before the day fully began, we were untouched. He had lasted the whole night, standing beside me, quiet, patient, alive. And maybe that was the miracle. Not that he stayed, but that I finally learned how to. They came for him on a Thursday. Morning light had barely touched the fields when the trailer rolled down the gravel road, a low rumble that made every window tremble. I'd been awake all night, pacing the narrow aisle between stalls, whispering the same useless words to myself. "He's not ready. I'm not ready. We're not ready." Atlas stood quietly, already sensing what I could not yet accept. Horses know before people do. They feel endings in the air. He lifted his head when the engine cut, nostrils flaring, eyes wide and questioning. The woman who stepped out of the truck wore a white shirt too clean for this place. She had calm hands and a practiced smile, the kind meant to convince you she knew what she was doing. "Beautiful animal," she said. "You must be the one who worked with him." I nodded, because my voice didn't trust me. She offered a contract, paper fluttering in the wind like a trapped bird. My signature was already printed at the bottom, forged by consent I never gave out loud. The ranch owner had handled everything. All I had left was the goodbye. When they let him out, the sound of hooves on wood echoed like a countdown. I walked beside him, hand on his shoulder, until we reached the ramp. He hesitated, nostrils flaring again, as if asking me to say it wasn't real. "It's okay," I whispered. "Just step up. You'll be fine." But I wasn't convincing anyone, least of all myself. He climbed into the trailer, the hollow thud of hooves fading as the door closed behind him. The woman secured the latch, nodded once, and drove away. Dust rose from the tires, curling into the air until it disappeared into the light. And just like that, the field was empty. The barn was too quiet afterward. Every creak sounded wrong, every shadow heavier. His stall still smelled like him, warm hay and earth and the faint sweetness of sweat. I found one of his stray hairs caught in the wooden gate and pressed it between my fingers like proof that none of it had been imagined. I stayed until night fell, sitting in the straw, trying not to think. But thoughts have their own gravity. They pull you down no matter how you fight them. Without him, the silence inside me came roaring back. Days blurred. The diner, the same endless hours of pouring coffee for strangers who called me sweetheart and never looked twice. I smiled, took tips, wiped counters that didn't need cleaning. When I caught my reflection in the window, I barely recognized the woman staring back, eyes too hollow, posture too careful, like she was afraid of cracking in public. At night, I'd drive to the edge of the ranch and park by the fence. The fields looked different without him. Smaller somehow, unfinished. Sometimes I'd think I saw a dark shape moving near the ridge, and my heart would lurch before reason caught up. I started dreaming of him too. Running through fog, calling my name, the sound fading just before I could reach him. One morning, I woke with straw tangled in my hair. I'd fallen asleep in his stall again. A week passed before I couldn't stand it anymore. I called the ranch owner and asked where they'd sent him. She hesitated, then told me, an equestrian center 2 towns over near the coast. They'll treat him well, she said, like kindness was enough to close the distance. That evening, I got in my truck and drove. The highway stretched empty ahead, the sunset melting across the sky in streaks of red and gold. It felt wrong to chase something that had already left, but staying felt worse. When I reached the new stables, the air tasted different, salt and eucalyptus instead of dust. The ocean was close enough to hear a faint rhythmic crash beneath the gulls' cries. Rows of immaculate white barns lined the property, too perfect, too polished. I parked near the fence and waited until the staff thinned for the night. Then I saw him. He was in the far paddock, standing under a floodlight that bleached the world into silver and shadow. His coat gleamed darker than I remembered, mane trimmed shorter, but it was him. He lifted his head, eyes catching the light, and for a second, the years between heartbeats disappeared. I whispered his name. He froze. Then, slowly, he took a step toward the fence. Another, and another, until there was nothing between us but air and the low hum of the ocean wind. "Hey, boy," I said, voice breaking. "You remember me?" He exhaled, that same soft sound he used to make when I brushed his neck, and something inside me gave way. I reached through the fence, my fingers brushing his muzzle. Warm, real, present. The world stopped spinning for one impossible moment. He leaned closer, breath warm against my palm, and for the first time in days I felt alive again. The floodlight hummed above us, insects circling like fragments of light caught in orbit. His coat shimmered under it, and I could see how much muscle he'd gained, how someone had been training him, shaping him into something controlled, purposeful. But the calm in his eyes wasn't peace. It was resignation. He'd been taught to hold still. My throat tightened. "They're treating you well," I whispered, as if saying it out loud could make it true. His ears flicked forward, catching the sound of my voice, but there was a distance now, a thin, invisible wall between us built from days of absence. I wanted to climb the fence, to wrap my arms around his neck, to tell him we could just run. Just like before, through the fields, through everything, but I didn't. The world had rules, fences, and signatures that said ownership. I'd lost count of how long we stood there. The night air turned colder, the tide louder in the distance. A security light flared near the barns, footsteps echoing across the gravel. I whispered goodbye before he could see the tears. When I drove away, the headlights carved tunnels through the mist. I kept expecting to see him in the mirror, some dark figure chasing me through the fog, but it was only my own reflection, blurred by motion and grief. The weeks that followed stretched thin, like time itself was exhausted. I threw myself into work, took double shifts, said yes to everything. My manager called it dedication. I called it distraction. The sound of the espresso machine was a heartbeat I could depend on. When the rush ended, I'd catch myself staring at the empty booth by the window, where a little girl once drew horses on napkins while her mother drank coffee. Sometimes the girl would show me her drawings, long legs, wild manes, eyes too bright for paper. "They run forever," she'd said once, grinning. I wanted to believe her. But every night, when the world slowed, I found myself scrolling through photos I'd taken at the ranch, blurry shots of Atlas in motion, the kind that caught light and shadow more than shape. One of them showed him mid-gallop, suspended above the ground, every muscle alive with momentum. I stared at it until my vision blurred. That's when I decided to go back. Not to the coast, not to the ranch, but back to the beginning. The old trail that wound behind the paddocks. the one we used to ride when the moon was full. The night I returned, the air was brittle with cold. The moon hung low, a silver coin just above the treetops. Frost glimmered on the grass. The barn was empty now, half the stalls unlatched, dust settling on tools no one had touched since the sale. I walked through it like a ghost revisiting her own story. Every board, every nail seemed to whisper echoes of our nights. The rhythm of breath, the soft scrape of hooves, the quiet language of trust that no one else had heard. At the far end, the old saddle still hung from its peg. My hand trembled when I reached for it. The leather was stiff with disuse, cold against my skin. For a second, I could almost hear him snort softly behind me, impatient for the ride. The silence hurt. Outside, fog curled over the fields. I followed the fence line to the ridge, boots crunching through frost. From there, the land stretched out endless and pale, the river winding like a ribbon of glass under the moon. This was where he'd bolted that night. The same slope, the same wind, the same pulse of something larger than either of us. I stood there for a long time, hands stuffed into my coat, breath turning to smoke. I thought of how everything moves in circles, storms, migrations, grief. Maybe he'd be back one day, I told myself. Maybe the world would bring him home when it was done reshaping him. But hope is a dangerous thing when you've already lost something once. Winter came early that year. Frost hardened into ice, and mornings turned white before dawn. The ranch grew quiet, fewer visitors, fewer horses. I stayed, helping where I could, patching fences, cleaning stalls that didn't need it. The owner barely spoke to me now. She thought I was obsessed. Maybe she was right. But obsession is just love that doesn't know where to go. Then one evening, as I locked up the feed room, I heard tires crunching on gravel. A truck, small and unmarked, pulling a trailer. My heart stopped before my mind caught up. It wasn't him. I told myself that even before I looked, it couldn't be. But when the door swung open and I saw that familiar dark coat, those amber eyes catching the porch light, I forgot how to breathe. Atlas stepped down, cautious but steady. His mane was shorter, his coat sleek, his body leaner, like time had sculpted him into something new. But the way he looked at me, that hadn't changed. "He's being retired," the driver said, slapping paperwork against the truck door. "Owner decided he's not fit for competition. Figured you folks might take him back." I didn't speak. Couldn't. I just walked forward, hand trembling as I reached for him. He came to me without hesitation. The moment his muzzle touched my shoulder, everything else fell away. The weeks of silence, the miles between us, the ache I'd carried like a second heartbeat. He was home. That night, I didn't leave the barn. I sat in the straw beside his stall, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, carrying the scent of rain. He was different. Quieter, maybe older. But there was a calmness in him that hadn't been there before. I could see it in the way he stood, the way his eyes softened when I spoke. He'd been somewhere I couldn't follow, and somehow he'd made peace with it. I envied him for that. When I finally slept, I dreamed of water, of waves crashing against cliffs, of a dark shape running along the shore. Not fleeing, not chasing, just running. Morning came slow, gold spreading through the barn slats like light trying to remember how to enter a darkened place. I woke to the sound of him shifting, the straw rustling beneath his weight. For a heartbeat. I didn't know if it had all been a dream. The trailer, the reunion, the warmth of his breath on my skin. But then he turned his head, and I saw it in his eyes. Recognition. Stillness. Home. He'd survived the world without me. And somehow, so had I. I rose quietly, brushing the hay from my coat, and stepped into the chill of dawn. The sky was pale and endless, streaked with pink and white. The air smelled of wet earth and something clean, the kind of scent that comes before change. Atlas followed me with his gaze as I opened the stall. His ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move until I said his name. Then, with a slow exhale, he stepped forward. We walked together into the pasture, the frost crunching under my boots. He moved close beside me, his flank brushing my shoulder every few steps, steadying me. I reached out and rested my hand on his neck, feeling the rhythm of his pulse under the skin. It was the same beat that had steadied me through everything, the same quiet thrum that told me I wasn't alone. When we reached the fence, I let him go. For a moment he just stood there, nostrils flaring, eyes wide, as if the open field was something new again. Then, with a flick of his tail, he broke into a slow trot. Watching him run was like watching time undo itself. The cold morning light caught along his back, each muscle moving with impossible grace. He wasn't the wild creature I first met, or the frightened one from that storm night. He was something else now, something freer. And seeing that filled me with a strange kind of ache. Joy sharpened by loss. Love shadowed by the knowledge that everything beautiful eventually moves beyond us. I leaned against the fence, my breath turning white in the air, and let the tears come without shame. They weren't the same kind of tears I used to cry, not the kind that burned or begged. These were quiet, grateful. They fell easily, and the earth took them without question. Weeks passed. Winter softened its hold, and the first hints of spring began to color the fields. Atlas grew stronger again, his coat thickening, his stride easy. Sometimes I'd ride him along the ridge at sunset, when the world turned to fire. We didn't go fast anymore. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed, no longer heavy, no longer something to fill. It was a language of its own. Every time I brushed him, I thought of the places he must have seen without me. The sea wind, the distant arenas, the hands that tried to teach him what he already knew. And I wondered if he'd thought of me, too, in the quiet hours before dawn, the way I'd thought of him. He'd come back, but not to stay forever. I could feel it, the way one feels the change in the weather before the sky decides what it will do. He was restless sometimes, standing by the fence and staring at the horizon. Not the kind of restlessness born from fear. It was something gentler, deeper. Like he was remembering the world beyond the gates, and maybe that was the point of all this. We'd found each other when we were both broken, learned to stand again, learned to breathe. But healing doesn't mean holding on forever. It means learning to let go without shattering. The last morning we rode together, the sky was cloudless, a wide expanse of blue so pure it hurt to look at. I let him out early before anyone else had come to the ranch. The grass was wet with dew, and the air was sharp and sweet. We climbed the ridge trail slowly, the wind tugging at my hair, his hooves pressing perfect prints into the soft earth. When we reached the top, I dismounted and let the reins fall. The valley stretched beneath us, a wash of gold and green. The river caught the light like a thread of silver. Everything was still. I stood beside him and whispered, "You're free, you know." He turned his head toward me, ears flicking, eyes calm. I reached up, fingers tangled in his mane. "You stayed as long as I needed you to," I said. "Maybe longer than you should have. But I think I finally understand. We can't stop time, or endings, or whatever it is that pulls us apart. All we can do is keep moving, keep breathing, keep choosing the next step." He huffed softly, warm breath curling into the wind. Then he turned away, facing the open stretch beyond the ridge. I unclipped the reins. He hesitated just once, his gaze finding mine. And then he moved, slow at first, then faster, until he was running, mane streaming behind him, body swallowed by sunlight. I watched until he became a blur, a shape made of light and motion, until even the sound of his hooves dissolved into distance. I stood there long after he was gone. The wind tugged at my coat, carrying with it the scent of grass and rain and everything that had ever meant home. I didn't cry this time. I just breathed, slow and steady, and listened to the quiet. For the first time, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like space, wide enough for both of us to keep existing, even apart. When I walked back down the trail, the morning had turned golden. The ranch glowed in the light, the fences throwing long shadows across the fields. Every sound, the creak of the barn door, the distant cry of a hawk, felt sharper, truer. Inside, his stall was open, the air still carrying a trace of him. I brushed my hand along the wood, rough under my palm, and whispered a thank you I didn't have words for. Not goodbye, never goodbye, just gratitude. For the storm, for the silence, for the nights that lasted forever, and the mornings that finally came. He'd taught me what staying meant, and also what leaving had to mean too. As I stepped outside, the light broke fully over the ridge, dazzling and complete. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. Somewhere out there I knew he was running, not away, not toward, just running because he could. Because he was alive. Because he was free. And in that moment, I realized I was too. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, almost imagined sound of hooves over the hills. It might have been memory, it might have been real. Either way, I smiled. We couldn't stop doing it. The loving, the losing, the beginning again. And maybe that was the whole point. The horse had lasted the whole night, and so had I.